Hello, hello, hello. All right, we are in very very close to the finish line. We are now into our last two lectures. Um, I refer to these last two as Reconstruction. Well, in actuality, this first lecture is just talking about the aftermath of the Civil War and the Lincoln assassination. Then, for the last lecture, we will actually do Reconstruction itself. This time frame that we are going to be talking about is 1865 to 1877. The key points, which you will only need in the last lecture, we're not going to get to any of the key points in this one, are the Black Codes, the Civil Rights Amendments, sharecropping. Sharecropping is also known as tenancy, and the Compromise of 1877. All right. So, today I'm kind of continuing on and really focusing on how little we know and why we should dig so much deeper into history. Right? I've been talking about it all semester long, how the textbooks are more civic religion than they are actually objective or factual based, evidence based history. They are trying to give an agenda. Good history just tries to understand what happened and how it shaped us. And to start off with, going into this last one, I want to quote one of my favorite American philosophers. That's the best way. I think that's the best way to describe him. And his name is George Santayana. All right. The quote I'm going to give you, I think, is a great quote to end the semester on. History is always written wrong, and so always needs to be rewritten. All right. So let it settle in. All right. History is always written wrong, and so always needs to be rewritten. All right. So, with that, let's move on into the aftermath. And with this, the first real thing we're going to talk about is death. Lots and lots of death. On the Union side, you had 360,000 plus dead, more than 275,000 wounded, and a large majority of this time, the wounded that went home, those 275,000, were the ones in the surgeon's tent that got pieces of limbs or limbs taken off. Muskets, cannonballs, the war was horrific. So, with that, 360,000 deaths, 275,000 wounded, and in many of these instances, the wounded would never be able to really do anything in a work environment of the 1800s. Many of them would have to be taken care of. On the Confederate side, all right, you had 258,000 dead and more than 190,000 wounded. So, all in all, grand total, as of about 10 years ago, they still find stuff, they still add stuff, but the last time they did a consolidated effort to give up to date stats, there were more than 625,000 dead because of this war, and that is just combatants. That's not civilians and others that were around it. That is combatants. And that, to kind of give you an idea, that is 1 out of every 11 men from the ages of 15 to 45, which is most men during this time frame. So 1 out of 11 would die. And of course, the grand total for wounded is 460,000. So, in essence, almost a million Americans would be out of the equation, or at least severely affected by the Civil War. All right. So, a little bit of the aftermath. Another thing that I want to kind of keep with let's see. With this aftermath idea, let's talk about the after effects on the southern population. All right. And by the southern population, I mean the African Americans and the white Americans. All right. So, with this, one of the things you'll see, this supposed great new world post-Civil War, the African Americans first thought, and when they were coming out, this idea of freedom would lead to voting rights, participation in economics and society. What they were really thinking is things were going to, they would be able to climb that social ladder. However, the views of African Americans in that time period in the South that would be established by the European white Americans were very, very derogatory. They still viewed them as dumb beasts of burden, not even human, and they would start on this large campaign to degrade African Americans. So all the whites in the South would turn on them. Also, by the end of this Reconstruction time frame, for that brief period of Reconstruction, really only about 8 years, truth be told, you'll have the federal government in the South trying to protect African American rights, voting rights, legal rights, economic rights, but they'll just abandon the African American. And the African American would be set adrift in a river of hate and oppression. All right? And what can they do? Many of them would, during the late 1800s, just settle in and try to do what they can there or move west. The treatment during this time becomes more and more horrific. By about like 72, 73, the tide starts turning in the Northern Army and the Northern people that are here trying to help the African Americans get tired of doing it. And the Southerners get more and more power back. And by the Southerners, I mean ex-Confederates. And as more Confederates get back into Southern government, what ends up happening is they establish things like the Ku Klux Klan and really start oppressing the African American and promoting white supremacy. All right. So this is the African American plight post Civil War. All right, next. Let's talk about the European American or white American plight in the South. Materially speaking, um, historians say somewhere between $1 to $4 billion was destroyed because of the Civil War. So, um, and that's how you want it. The way they do that is however they want to do it. Like if they want what they want to include in destruction, if they want to include land, economics, loss of slaves, a lot of other factors. But it's safe to say at least three, more likely upwards, and to the 3 up billion was lost by the white South, all across the board, from the top to the bottom. The farm values in the South drop 41%. And for the subsistence farmers, for the yeomanry, for that plain folk, that is a huge hit. You also have this psychological damage. The defeat of this war would create a cognitive dissonance, and that you'll hear about when we move in. If you guys join me for like modern America, America 2 next semester, this cognitive dissonance starts off with the lost cause and the idea that the South will rise again. And all of that is pushed, promoted, and they do their damnedest to enforce it through violence and politics and economics and everything. But the key thing to remember is white supremacy is at the core. Also, they were the white Southerners, the Confederate white Southerners, were terrified of revenge. That these newly freed African Americans would want their revenge on them now that they were free. So this is another thing that leads this cognitive dissonance into these hateful and oppressive measures. Also, here's what I think is a very interesting little fact. Historians have looked into this and studied it and have asked, how long has it taken for the South to recover from the Civil War? All right. And the opinions differ. Some saying all the way up to my generation. I'm from Generation X. People born in the late 60s, all the way up to through most of the 70s. So many historians believe that all the way up until my generation, the South was really, really hugely affected with the aftermath and the math, I guess you could say, of the Civil War. All right. So, we've got a little bit about the New World. Also, another thing to bring in is this idea in the South of what freedom was. Right? Yet again, we need to divide this into two groups: the African American South and this European white American South. For the African Americans, this meant a chance to rebuild their world on their own, in their own way. Also, this was the death of slavery. They were hoping for and pushing for and fighting for equal rights. Well, we'll simplify it. They were fighting for equality, political, legal rights, and these same liberties afforded to the whites by the Constitution. And also, one of the biggest things, and one of the ones that would be taken most advantage of during this time frame in the late 1800s, was movement. The idea of being free is it meant that they could go wherever they wanted to go, whenever they wanted to. This idea of being able to move was huge. Also, we have the European white Southerners and the former planter elite starts pushing this idea that they just want things to be normal. They want normalization. They want things to be the way it used to be. And if everything was the way it used to be, things would be calm and everything would be all right. The main way they would push for this, that white planter elite, those ex-Confederates, would be through the lost cause. All right. Edward Pollard, who is a newspaperman, a journalist, would publish an article in 1868 called Supremacy of the White Race. And out of that, we have the Klan. We have a lot of the ideas of white supremacy that would just take off and still be with us to this very day somehow. But Pollard, with this article, would kick off this idea of the South will rise again, that the South was the real America, and it would come back. So, notions of freedom. The white side wanted to go back to the old ways, at least the people in power did, and the African Americans had numerous views of what freedom could be. All right. So, with that, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This event occurs on April the 14th, 1865. All right. This is a lot more complicated than people were led to believe and that you were taught in the school books. All right. This whole idea was pushing. This was not just John Wilkes Booth killing the president. It was a larger conspiracy, a larger plot, a larger assassination attempt. Booth would, of course, attack and kill the president. He would be a successful assassin. He had other people that were involved, though. Lewis Payne, David Harold, George Atzerodt were the other main men. All right. Lewis Payne, he's also known as Lewis Powell, was a ex-Confederate cavalry, and he would be assigned to kill William Seward, who was the Secretary of State. George Atzerodt was a friend of Booth's that would supposedly, not supposedly, but he was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson, the VP. All right, so this plot, organized and planned by John Wilkes Booth, was going after the president, the Secretary of State, and the VP. The whole idea of it was if they could kill these men in one strike, they were supposed to attack around 10 p.m. on the night of April the 14th and take these three guys out. What many historians believe is that Booth was hoping to send the Union government, the American government, into just complete chaos, which would allow for the Confederates to regroup and continue the war. That's the belief. In actuality, and another possibility is that Booth just hated Lincoln so much that he just wanted him dead, and he wanted to kill as many Union political leaders as possible. John Wilkes Booth, all right, he was an actor. I don't know if you guys knew this. John Wilkes Booth came from an acting family. His father and his brothers were actors, very famous actors. His brother Edwin was considered one of the most brilliant actors of the 1800s. He was nicknamed the Master. His father was famous for his Shakespearean talents, just like Edwin was. But John Wilkes was different than the other brothers and his father. He was not very good at memorizing his lines. He's not very good at traditional Shakespearean stuff, which everybody liked. But with all the modern stuff, he was really good. He was able to emote. He was able to use charisma and energy and this vitality and his what most people refer to as beauty to just overwhelm people. Um, he was considered one of the most beautiful men in the 1800s. Women all over the nation were in love with him. Just think, like uh, basically John Wilkes Booth from the 1840s, 50s, all the way up until the assassination was basically the sexiest man alive. All right. He was at the top of the heap. Everybody in America knew him. Everybody in America loved him. He was one of the most charismatic actors ever up to that point. And people all over the nation would go anywhere they could to see him because he just carried the performance above and beyond. So he came from the most famous acting family of the 1800s. He was the most charismatic and the most beloved, and many thought the most, beautiful, handsome, however you want to put it, man in America. Just think of it this way: this is the dude that shot the president. Think of um, Brad Pitt or even the young kids now, all the people that people consider hot and beautiful and above a standard above. It's like if one of the most popular, handsomest men in Hollywood would walk up in front of everybody at a big, huge public event and kill the president. That's what happened. It just drove America wild. Nobody understood what the hell was going on. So, Booth and his plot, and the other men that came with him would instigate this. Booth would be successful. The traditional story goes Booth would come up, shoot Lincoln. He would slash the military man that was with Lincoln, Rathbone, and then shoot Lincoln and kill him, leap over the thing. The old story goes one of his legs gets tangled in the flags dangling off of the presidential seat, and he falls onto the stage, breaking his ankle. That did not happen. That is a myth. What actually happens is he's successful in the box, he leaps off, lands on the stage. Basically, he says in Latin, "Death to all tyrants," as everybody in the audience sees him. Then he runs out, hops on his horse, and takes off. All right. David Harold was with him, but Booth's horse was a little too rambunctious, a little too lively, not very trustworthy, and he and the horse would topple in the escape. The horse would land on him, and that would be what broke his leg and what would slow them down and cause a lot of problems for them in the long run. That's the reality of the situation. So, Payne, Lewis Payne or Lewis Powell, whichever name you want to use, he was assigned to William Seward, the Secretary of State. Seward was in bed at home He had had a carriage accident. I think it was like a week or a few weeks before this night. Um, in the beginning, nobody thought he would survive it, but he did. And what would happen, he had this brace on his body, and he had this neck brace on his head that was mainly made out of leather and metal. Um, Lewis would come up to the door, say he was from the pharmacy to bring pain. Lewis was going to bring the medicine to Seward, and they let him in. He would go up the stairs. One of Seward's sons would think he was not right. They didn't trust him. He would try to stop him. Payne would put out his gun and try to shoot Seward's son. But it wouldn't work. So, so Lewis Payne jumped on Seward's son and just started beating him with the gun. He would then go into Seward's room. One of Seward's daughters were there, and she would scream and start crying. The whole house would be alerted. But at that point, Payne has already got his Bowie knife, leaps on Seward, and stabs him numerous times, and keeps stabbing him until people pull him off. He slashes his face, his head, his neck, his chest, just all over him, trying to kill him. But that brace and everything he was in saved him. Payne, like I said, hit him in the neck, hit him in the head, hit him all over the place. But the brace he had, because of all of his injuries, was mainly leather and metal, and it protected him from death blows. So when everybody came in to go after Payne, Payne leaped out of the second floor window in the house and ran off into the night. All right. George Atzerodt, the other one that was supposed to kill somebody, he was going after the vice president, Andrew Johnson. However, Atzerodt was not the most reliable person, and he ended up a few days before getting a room as close as he could to the VP at a very popular hotel in DC. And when the time had come to do this, Atzerodt got really nervous and went to the bar to start drinking to calm his nerves before he had to do it. And by the time had come where Powell and Booth were attacking their two men, Atzerodt had gotten so drunk he didn't do anything. And he just kept drinking and kept drinking until the next day. At that point, when everybody knew Lincoln was dead and they were looking for conspirators, he fled. So, with all of this, the only successful one was Booth. All right. Everybody else, nobody's, that's why nobody remembers them. They were all a part of this, and even before this had turned into an assassination attempt, these men had tried 2 other times that we know of to kidnap Lincoln. All right. So this group, overall, Booth picked poor underlings. All right. But there are a lot of theories. This is where this idea of a lone nut comes from, that's always been pushed with every assassination in American history. Is this one guy, and he just loses grip on reality. Some came up with that this was a plot by the Republican Party, the more radical Republicans, to get rid of Lincoln. Also, this was pushed that it was a Confederate plot. Booth had been raising money and getting arms for the Confederacy for a while. He was also a part of a spy ring ran by Jediah Benjamin, who was in the Confederate government. So it could be a Confederate plot to assassinate these people. It could have been a Republican plot by the radicals in the Republican Party that thought Lincoln wouldn't punish the Confederates. Um, other other theories say it was the banking industry, the international huge house banks. Some even said it was the Catholic Church that was behind this. So you've got all kinds of crazy theories, and you got some legitimate ones. Um, but in the end, it's it's really all about Booth. Booth had an intense hatred for Lincoln. All right. Booth was raised in Bel Air, Maryland. It was out in the country. His parents were, and all the way until everybody was his brothers, sisters, parents, everybody in his family was pro union. But he grew up in a slave state in Maryland and grew up with others of the wealthy class who were slave owners. So, from a very early age, he was around slavery and accepted it, whether his family did or not. And as he grew up, he was mainly in and most popular in the South, in the East, and which you had slavery all over the place. And when Lincoln came into power, um, one of the things he did, we talked about in the Civil War, he had troops in Maryland and Kentucky where it was like a insurance policy that these two southern states would not secede and go with the Confederates. And one of the things he did was he created martial law and basically took away the Bill of Rights. He took away habeas corpus, he took away freedom of speech, protest, all of that stuff. And Booth at this point believed that the government, and a lot of Americans believed that the government could not and should not be able to take away the Bill of Rights. And with this, his hatred for Lincoln grows and grows and grows. He sees him as a tyrant, a despot. And remember, Booth is an actor. He did a lot of Shakespeare and Julius Caesar with Brutus and all this thing where you have the assassination of Caesar. Booth started thinking of himself as Brutus, as one of the men plotting to kill and take out the tyrant that was destroying the country. And this would keep going and going and going until the late 1850s, when he would just basically stop acting, drop out of everything, and work on helping the Confederates, and then his kidnapping plots and his assassination. Well, Lincoln's assassination. So with this, Booth saw himself as Brutus, as the nation's tool, as God's tool to kill a tyrant and bring America back to democracy. He wrote about it often in all of his books, how this was God's appointment to him, how God told him and pushed him in the way of taking out Lincoln. So, we've got Booth doing the deed, right? And Booth is the only successful one, but throughout town, everybody hears about what's going on, this big plot. And the military goes out and captures everybody other than Harold and Booth. Harold was the one that knew the best ways around Virginia on down into the South, where they could hopefully all escape. And he was with Booth. So Harold and Booth take off. And this would be the largest manhunt in American history. The federal government would offer a $100,000 reward, which was the largest at any point in American history up until then. To think about it, If the government offered a reward like this today, what was 100,000 then would be 1.5 million today. All right. So imagine this wanted poster goes up to capture this guy and his accomplices. But if you got Booth, you got 100,000. But like if you got this most wanted one today, you'd get 1.5 million. They also had rewards for Harold and the other guys, and they were like 50,000, 25,000 for the other dudes. But for Booth, you got 100,000. In today's money, 1.5 million. So, Booth and Harold go on the run. Well, all of this is going on. Lincoln is across from Ford Theater in this man's home, bleeding out as doctors and people attend to him, trying to save him. The gun that Booth used was a small Derringer. He had bought it for the sole purpose of killing the president. And you can actually see it in Ford's Theater, in the museum part of it, where you can go down and look at it. This gun is elaborate. It's beautiful. And Booth said in his journals that he needed one of the most amazing guns, a gun that could be displayed in museums, because to him, he was going to be viewed as a hero for killing this tyrant in American history. He would be seen as, on down the road, as the man that freed us from this tyrant. So he bought this elaborate, beautiful gun because he knew it would be displayed after he killed Lincoln with it. So, in this aftermath, Booth and Harold are on the run. Atzerodt and Lewis are running around town, hiding in D.C., trying to stay out of the mix. After about a week, Atzerodt and Lewis Powell / Payne get caught. All right. But Booth and Harold still on the run. The federal government comes into Ford's Theater. The army, all kinds of other people. They move Lincoln, like I said, across the road to this man's home, where he would be cared for. And the military goes to work, interviewing everybody that they could find that was in there on the streets, everybody they could get in that area at the time of the assassination. All in all, they would interview more than 1,500 different people. And the issue with it is they couldn't get any good info. No two accounts were the same. Everybody saw it in different light, in different perspective, in different ways. So all the stories, all these interviews that the American government did to try to understand what was going on, what happened, made things even more confusing. And you'll see, even in modern day, cops say a case to solve is a lot easier if you don't have eyewitnesses. All right. So, with this, Booth goes on the run. After weeks of hunting, the U.S. military corner him and Harold in a tobacco barn. Harold surrenders himself. Booth keeps trying to get the lead, the man in charge of the army there, to face him in single combat and end this. But nothing comes of it, and Booth is about to run out of the barn and start shooting at the troops when Boston Corbett, one of those troops, sees Booth through a crack and takes a shot and hits him and severs his neck. So Booth is completely paralyzed. The soldiers pull him out of the barn that they had set on fire, and Booth would die in their custody. All right. All kinds of stories out there about if that was Booth or not. But in that time of the manhunt, in the east and in the south and north and heading out west, more than 300 Americans were killed just because they looked like John Wilkes Booth. So the American people go crazy. They want the reward. They want to get the man that killed the president. So this causes a lot of collateral damage all over the nation. But in the end, those that did survive would be put to trial by military tribunal, even though they were citizens, which is a very iffy thing. And all would be convicted and hung. All right. So, what we've got today, we talked about the aftermath of the war. We talked about the assassination attempt. If you really want to get into it, about the end of the Civil War or this assassination, there are a lot of good books. Well, I don't know, a lot of books and a lot of good books by reliable historians in the modern era. But there are some that were written during the 1800s and early 1900s by people that could have and did have firsthand accounts from people. One of them, I'll tell you the list. It's Blood on the Moon, Civil War Echoes, all right, The Curse of Cain, One Mad Act, The Web of Conspiracy, and The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. All right, so all of these are older books from the time that are really intriguing and fascinating to see how the people of the late 1800s or the 1800s, early 20th century viewed what occurred with the assassination with Booth. Two other great books about Booth and the assassination. They're both modern. One is American Brutus, and the other is called Manhunt. All right. So, with that, another lecture down. Hopefully, everybody has a safe semester and you stay healthy.